In 2011, EA announced a sequel to one of the most impressive RTS games ever made, running on the Frostbite 2 engine with a brilliant geopolitical storyline. It would have had 3 asymmetric factions and branching campaigns. 2 years later they cancelled it after gutting the single player, pivoting to free-to-play, and stripping out everything demanded by the community. They then closed the studio and walked away. Some people have never forgiven them. The story didn't end there, because 12 years after that cancellation, EA did something entirely out of character and handed the full source code to the community. What's happening now could turn out to be more interesting than the game that never arrived. This is the full story of Command & Conquer Generals 2. Just in case you're not aware of this game, here's a quick refresher. Command & Conquer Generals launched in 2003 and broke every rule established by the franchise. A contemporary setting with factions straight out of real-world geopolitics, the gameplay dumped the classic CNC sidebar interface in favour of something that felt more immediate and aggressive. China banned the game for smearing the image of the Chinese military. Germany had to replace all the infantry with cyborgs to get it past censors. And we argued about whether it was even a true Command & Conquer game for years afterwards. The asymmetry between those 3 factions was perfect. The GLA had no air force and no power grid. They rebuilt from the rubble of destroyed buildings and scavenged parts from wrecked vehicles to upgrade their own. As expected, the USA brought overwhelming air superiority and expensive, powerful units. China used massed infantry, cheap armour, and nuclear weapons. This forced a level of tactical thinking that most modern RTS games still can't touch. The Zero Hour expansion pushed it further, with 9 sub-faction generals who changed the way the 3 factions played, and a competitive scene formed around it that simply refused to die. People are still running zero-hour tournaments right now, 22 years after release. This is what EA had, and what they let go with some terrible decision making. The sequel needed to keep that focus, and for a brief window in 2011, it looked like it might. At the Spike Video Game Awards in December 2011, EA pulled the curtain back on Command & Conquer Generals 2. BioWare Victory were given the job of making it on the Frostbite 2 engine that was already powering Battlefield 3. The trailer showed photorealistic environments, destructible terrain, and a level of visual fidelity that strategy games had never come close to before. There was talk of bringing the franchise back to its roots and combining strategic gameplay with fast-paced action. Every word sounded like exactly what the community had been asking for. The excitement lasted about 5 minutes before reality started setting in, but those 5 minutes were good. Generals 2 was set after the events of Zero Hour in a world that had shifted dramatically. The United States had reverted to isolationism and lost most of its global influence. In the power vacuum, China stepped up as a new world power, forging closer ties with the European Union. The alliance collapsed when relations between China and the EU fell apart, resulting in 2 new superpower blocs. China and several East Asian nations formed the Asia-Pacific Alliance. The EU unified the militaries of its member states and became the most technologically advanced faction in the world. The APA was the dominant military power dealing with the aftermath of the broken alliance. The EU was the technologically superior force playing empire and calling it peacekeeping. And then there was the reconstituted Global Liberation Army. This version of the GLA had access to technology far beyond anything a decentralized terrorist network should have been able to get its hands on. Bloody uprisings were destabilizing key APA and EU satellite nations, and nobody could work out where the equipment was coming from. The setup had the APA dispatching a force to infiltrate the latest rebellion, targeting an EU-backed dictator. The mission was to uncover the truth about the new GLA, undermine EU influence, and restore some kind of stability. It was a geopolitical thriller with a conspiracy at its centre, set in an RTS framework with branching campaign storylines where player choices influenced outcomes. Planned multiplayer had customisable armies and full modding support. This was an ambitious game in a world that felt real, with factions that had clear motivations behind them. The kind of sequel that could have justified an 8-year wait. Then, out of nowhere, EA decided it would rather have a different game entirely. Within a year of the announcement, the studio was renamed to Victory Games. This was a major red flag. EA announced the Generals 2 was being changed to a free-to-play title, rebranded to simply Command & Conquer, with the entire game rebuilt around an unpopular monetization model. All that lore and those branching storylines got shelved. EA considered downloadable campaigns released faction by faction at some unspecified future date. Everyone correctly interpreted this as, "We'll see if it makes financial sense later." EA's president at the time tried to frame this as a strength by talking about how free-to-play gave them the ability to adjust and adapt to community feedback. We all saw this as corporate framing for them not deciding what the game was yet, but already deciding how they wanted to make money from it. At a community summit in December 2012, select community members got hands-on time with the game and shared feedback with the developers. The feedback, along with everything else the community had been saying since the free-to-play announcement, was overwhelmingly consistent. This is not what we asked for. The pay-to-win concern dominated every conversation. The community could see the trajectory clearly. This was a game where your wallet would determine your army composition. The community pushed back hard. 1 year later, EA cancelled the game. The official statement cited negative fan feedback about the free-to-play experience, so at least they were honest. They were told repeatedly that stripping out single-player content and building the whole thing around microtransactions was a terrible idea. To EA's limited credit, they did eventually listen, instead of giving us something nobody wanted. But framing this as "we listened to fans" doesn't let EA off the hook. They didn't cancel a bad game, they cancelled the hollowed out remnants of what could have been a great game after spending 2 years systematically removing everything that would have made it great. The geopolitical storyline with the fallen America, the EU empire, and the mysteriously upgraded GLA got thrown out. The branching campaigns were abandoned. They took a sequel with ambition and a compelling world and rebuilt it as a live service monetization vehicle. And when that vehicle failed to generate excitement, they didn't go back to the original version, they just killed the project, scattered the team, and moved on. Command & Conquer as a franchise was effectively dead. For the next decade, the only CNC content coming from EA was a mobile game that nobody took seriously, and the CNC Remastered Collection in 2020. Generals and Zero Hour sat untouched, running on a 20-year-old engine with known bugs that would never be patched, kept alive entirely by community effort. That community effort was substantial. When GameSpy servers went down and took the official multiplayer infrastructure with them, the CNC Online project stepped in to replace it. Tournaments kept running, mods kept being developed and released. Content creators kept producing videos and guides. The competitive scene continued as though EA's abandonment was a minor inconvenience and not a death sentence. There were multiple attempts to reverse engineer the Sage engine that powered Generals. The Open Sage project tried to recreate the engine behaviour by observing how the game ran and reading data files. The Time project took a different approach, attempted to replace the original executable piece by piece through binary analysis. Both projects made progress, but the fundamental problem was the same. There were volunteers trying to reconstruct a professional game engine without seeing the original code. It was painstaking work that moved slowly by nature, and the community accepted that reality because there was no alternative. Until there was. EA released the complete source code for Command & Conquer Generals in Zero Hour in February 2025. The original codebase was released under an open source license that allowed anyone to modify and redistribute it. CC Hyper spent the previous year working with EA stakeholders to restore the source code from archives back to buildable states, and the result was the most comprehensive open source release for a major game franchise in years. This was the complete codebase, everything needed to build the game from scratch. One of the engineers who worked on the original Generals commented on the release, saying he was tempted to port the whole thing to Unreal 5 for fun, which gives you a sense of how complete and usable the code is. The response was immediate. Within days, over 400 forks of the EA repository appeared on GitHub. The Super Hackers group, which had already been maintaining a community patch project for years, became the central hub for development. They updated the codebase and set up build support for both Windows and Linux. They started systematically fixing bugs that had been present since the original 2003 release. There was a real risk of fragmentation at this point, with hundreds of individual forks all working in isolation. A discussion on the Super Hackers GitHub called "A Call from the Future" made the case for uniting under a single collaborative repository instead of splintering into dozens of competing projects. The argument was straightforward. The GPL license encourages sharing and collaboration, so code written by one contributor can flow freely into the work of others without legal barriers, but only if everyone is working together. That call to action brought in expertise from across the community, including the people from the Time Reverse Engineering project, whose years of work could now be validated against the real source code. A community meeting was organised within days of the release. A community patch project was formally established, and the first priority was fixing the multiplayer desync issues that had been plaguing the game for 2 decades. The roadmap included removing the 30 FPS cap that's currently tied to game speed, building proper 64-bit versions without memory limitations, and getting the game running natively on Linux. This is all happening during what looks like a proper RTS resurgence. Tempest Rising launched in April 2025 and could have been CNC5. It was nominated for Best Sim Strategy at the Game Awards and proves there is still a paying audience for this kind of game. EA looked at the RTS genre and decided it wasn't worth investing in. They looked at Generals 2 and saw only a monetization opportunity. They looked at the community keeping a 20-year-old game alive through sheer stubbornness and concluded there was nothing there worth supporting. Every tournament running on community-maintained servers, every mod uploaded to ModDB, every YouTube video breaking down strategies for Zero Hour, all of it was evidence that the audience had never left. But EA had. The Generals 2 that was announced in 2011 is never going to exist. What's happening with the source code release is something different and more interesting. The community now has the tools to fix problems EA left unresolved for 20 years, to modernise an engine that was built before today's hardware existed, and to take the game in directions that a corporate development team never would have explored. There are no microtransactions in a GPL repository. There's no live service model in a community patch project. There's just people who love a game working together to keep it alive and make it better. If EA had understood that 12 years ago, we might have had a very different story to tell. This has been Critical Moves. Thanks for watching.